This is Anisa Archer on the 20th of February 2020, recording for Lights Up at Derby Theatre. Please can you introduce yourself and tell me where and when you were born?
My name is Amanda Whittington. I was born in Nottingham in 1968.
And what do you do?
I'm a playwright, so I write scripts, plays, dramas for theatre and radio, mainly.
What is your connection to the East Midlands?
Born here, parents from Nottingham, from West Bridgford, was born here, raised, worked here until my mid-40s. So I've lived in Nottingham in the East Midlands most of my life. Now I live in West Yorkshire, but I consider myself, a pure East Midlander.
Lovely. Who did you live with growing up?
I live with my parents, my mum Sue, and my dad Dave, and my brother Paul, who's 18 months younger than me.
And what did your parents do for work?
Well, my dad was a quantity surveyor first. I think he left school at 15, and then he trained after he left school. He went to night school and became a quantity surveyor, and he did that until his 40s. And then he had a kind of career change. He was always really good at arts and crafts and stuff with his hands, so he became a painter and decorator and started making furniture. And he also took up acting in later life as well, so he had a kind of big turn in his life, really. My mum was a mum and a housewife until I was about 10, I think, so she was at home full time. And then she went back and retrained as a secretary, and she went into a state agency, and she absolutely loved that. She loved working. It was really kind of the making of her. So she was working in a state agency till she retired in her early 60s.
Can you remember your first memory of theatre?
I can. I think we went to pantos, and I remember always being that kid who was petrified that they were going to get called up onto the stage. And I remember once there was Cinderella and they had the slipper under somebody's seat. I was thinking, please let it not be my seat. But my really first wow memory of theatre was I'd read the book Little Women, which my mum had given to me by Louisa May Alcott, and it had a profound effect on me. I just absolutely loved it, and that's about Jo, the central character of that, is a girl who wants to become a writer, and I just completely related to Jo. And it's interesting because now there's a new film version of Little Women and people are kind of talking about it again. So I'd read that book several times, and then it was on at the Theatre Royal in Nottingham. I think I was 7 at the time. And so mum got tickets, and I went with my mum and my nana, and the three of us went. And that was really quite special because I didn't think we'd ever gone out in the evening to do anything like that before. So it was a big deal. And I can just remember the whole experience. I can remember sitting in the Theatre Royal and the feeling of being in that building, and then seeing the story of Little Women on stage. And there's a moment where Jo has her hair cut off. And I remember the character Jo coming in with having had long hair to short hair, and it was just extraordinary. It's an iconic thing in the book, and I think just something clicked with me about the power and magic of telling stories on stage. I'd always been a reader, and I loved the book, but something about seeing it in the moment in 3 dimensions in that building was just amazing. And I can see the whole thing now still, so it kind of burned onto my consciousness.
What was the main trigger for you to want to work in the theatre?
Well, I think part that planted a seed, because prior to that I think I'd always thought about being an author. Don't know where it came from, I don't know where this desire to write came from, but as soon as I started reading I wanted to write, I think, and tell stories. And I do remember me and my brother I used to set up a little theatre in the garage and make him do plays for the other kids. And I found some old school bits and pieces from my primary school, and there's something about us doing Cinderella in the garage and all that. So that must have come from pantos. But then in secondary school, in the 80s, we had a fantastic drama department. It was a drama room and 2 teachers. But back then you could do O-level drama and A-level theatre studies, which I did. I think I was Southwards in Keyworth. That was one of the few schools in the county where you could do certainly A-level. So I got into drama through that really. I did O-level and just having all of that opened up to me, and the theory of drama and the practice and playwrights, and studying that for sort of 2 years on O-level as it was then an A-level. By the end of that, I was a massive sort of theatre geek, really. Yeah. And we used to go to Nottingham Playhouse and see everything. We had 50p tickets that we got through the council, through school. So I just got kind of really exposed to some amazing ideas and work through that experience of school, I think. And at the end of that, I was super keen to work in theatre. But again, I didn't quite see myself as being able to be a playwright at that time. I thought that was something that would come a lot later. I remember reading about stage management courses and wanting to do that, but not having, I don't know, the confidence, or just not applying. But that was at that age of sort of 16, 17, 18, that's what I thought my way in could be. And then I guess I left school and wanted to write. I knew I wanted to write, and started writing as a freelance journalist. So that's kind of how I started to make the transition into being a writer.
Yeah. Could you tell me more about what it was like being a freelance journalist?
Well, it's interesting because it was the late 80s, so I'd left school, I'd done my A-levels, I'd got a university place, but I decided I didn't want to go. I was being quite rebellious. Well, it was a kind of rebellious / having no confidence. You know, it kind of presented as being rebellious, that I'm not going to university, but actually it was kind of feeling, I just don't know whether I can do this. I don't feel able to do it for, all sorts of reasons, I think. I don't really know. So I took a year out and worked at Asda and did various jobs because, basically my parents said, well, if you're not going to university, you can go out there and work, really, which they were absolutely right to say, because I learned a huge amount in that year just by going out and working in ordinary jobs like people do, and kind of experiencing the world that way. But as this year came to an end, I thought, I don't want to go to university, I've deferred this place, I want to be a writer, I'm going to do it now. And it was almost a sort of get out for the inevitable of having to go and study for 3 years. And there was a scheme called the Enterprise Allowance Scheme in the 80s, which gave you £40 a week to set up your own business. And it was a way of getting people off the dole. And it was kind of amazingly kind of open. So if somebody wanted to be a window cleaner or open a shop or be a clothes designer or I don't know, whatever, you could just apply for this scheme. You put in your application, you had to go for a kind of a half-day session when they explained all about it, and then off you went. You were kind of signed up to it for 2 years. So I signed on the dole for 8 weeks in order to be eligible for this scheme. So I got on it as a freelance journalist. And they basically just sort of tick the paper and go, right, that's you, then you're a freelance journalist, and this money will come to you, £40 a week for two years, which was quite a lot of money then. So I got this government grant, £40, I got this title of freelance journalist, I got my parents on my back because they thought I was crazy, and I hadn't got any experience of being a journalist, so I had quite a lot to prove and quite a lot to live up to, really. So but back then, there was a boom in publishing. There was loads of quirky, weird little titles all over the place, that you could, magazines that on weird and wonderful subjects. So I just went to the library, looked at everything there was, and then started ringing editors. And the first thing I did was for a magazine called Office Secretary, which dates it, because there's no such thing about office, there are no office secretaries anymore, it's like some kind of throwback, isn't it? Because my mum worked in an office, I did it on an aspect of work called the YTS scheme, where young people were employed as secretaries. And I interviewed my mum, and I interviewed other people, and I produced this 2,000 words for this magazine. They said they'd take it, and they did, and they published it. And I thought, wow, gosh, this is possible. So then I just started doing that. I just started coming with any random and wild and crazy ideas, anything I could think of, to try and pitch to magazines. And back then it was surprisingly easy. And different to today, we got paid. You know, you got paid quite well then. It wasn't expected like it is now for sort of online content that you pitched stuff and wrote stuff and didn't get anything for it. So I just kind of learned on the job, really. I learned how to write to deadline. I learned how to write to a word count. I learned if I didn't write, I wouldn't get paid. So that was a discipline. I wrote to the Nottingham Evening Post and said, I'm 19, I'm a journalist, can I write for young people? And they said yes. So they gave me a weekly column. So that's how it started, really. So it was a combination of my naivety of just thinking, oh, well, you probably just ring up editors and they're okay with it, and they were. And the fact that I had to stick at it. And I do remember every month I used to think, just hang on in for another month and just get something to get me to this month and the next month and the next month. And it was like that for 2 years. Looking back, it probably seems easier than it was. But that's how I got going. I just came up with ideas and got on the phone, basically.
Sounds really, really interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
It's okay.
Who was your biggest inspiration in those early years?
I think in terms of journalism, I was a big fan of Julie Birchill, who was a journalist who'd started, I suppose, I started in a similar way to she did. She was a teenager who sent a piece to the NME, music magazine, and got that published, but then became a very sort of high-profile music writer and a controversial sort of opinion-based journalist. But what I liked about her was that she was a young woman. She was fearless in her writing, but she was also working, she was a working writer as well. She wasn't sort of waiting till the muse struck. She was filing her copy every week. So she was a big influence on me, really. And also, I was always massively into music. And again, it's so kind of forged in the 80s, really, all of this. But when I look back now at the 80s, what was in the charts and what was big, all the acts that were big, whether it be Culture Club or Adamant or the top-selling kind of number one acts, which were the big commercial acts, were also kind of incredibly artistic and individual and self-created. So there was a whole culture then where you could sort of create yourself and invent yourself. And what was different and weird and strange about you was also interesting and quite mainstream as well. And I was watching the Brits this week, and it just looks so kind of corporate and like a West End show. And it really makes me think back about now, just growing up in that culture where there were, when you watched big mainstream culture as music and films and all of that, it was incredibly individualistic. So I think I was just unconsciously influenced by that, really.
Yeah. What's your personal journey into the industry?
Well, starting as a journalist and doing that for the best part of, as a job for about 10 years, I think, from being 19 to late 20s, working for magazines and newspapers, but also doing some PR stuff as well, doing various things for like county councils and all that, writing very uninteresting things about the fire service, usually like the fire service's monthly staff magazine. Not that that was uninteresting, but it wasn't especially creative. So I spent the best part of 10 years doing that, earning my living, but it taught me to write directly and to communicate directly and to speak to people. So I wasn't writing literature, and I wasn't really trying to be especially intellectual about it. I was trying to just speak directly to the reader and tell the truth. And actually what I found was, as a journalist, when you're interviewing people, you record it and then you transcribe it, and then you find the quotes and you find the story within that conversation that you're going to write up. So that is kind of that was the elements of me beginning to understand playwriting, because you're transcribing speech and you're making speech into a story and you're using what people said. So actually that's dialogue, really. So I sort of found that actually journalism was quite an interesting training ground for a playwright in terms of having an ear for a story, what connected with people, and what people said and what they didn't say, which is all about what play is. It's kind of what people say and then all the subtext beneath it. So as I was being a journalist, working as a journalist, I was writing plays. I started writing plays in my early 20s. I wrote one that, I don't know, I think I wrote a couple that were just sort of went nowhere. So I started just sort of sending them off to various theatre companies and went absolutely nowhere, nothing happened. And then I met a woman called Gina Reeves, who ran a theatre company in Nottingham called Takeaway Theatre, which was a pub theatre company. And she didn't have any, in fact I interviewed her for the Evening Post, and she was, we just kind of clicked really. And she, as a company, they didn't have any funding. They paid for everything by box office. They used to take shows around little pubs all in Nottingham. And again, it was part of that kind of 80s create your own culture really, that kind of can-do thing. And of course that still happens today. But she said, at the end of this interview, I said, oh, I've written a play. And she said, oh, send it me then. So I did, and she liked it and she put it on. So I started to learn about production as well by working with Takeaway, this pub theatre company, and learning how to put on a show and what rehearsals were and lighting and how to sell a show and how to go around and put your posters up and get people in, all of that. So it was kind of, again, it was like on-the-job training. And it was brilliant, and I loved every minute of it. And from that, my confidence grew a bit, and I started sending work a bit more locally to the Playhouse, and I got a rehearsed reading of something at the Playhouse, and I got a commission from New Perspectives Theatre Company in Mansfield, purely because I think I'd had my work on from Takeaway, and I'd had reviews, and I'd had quite decent reviews, only local ones, but then I could send that along with the script, rather than it just being a random script that somebody had written. There was an opinion on it that was positive. So I got commissioned to write a youth theatre play by New Perspectives, and I ended up doing 3 youth theatre plays for them, and then writing for their main rural touring company. And one of the plays we did with Takeaway I'd sent to Soho Theatre, and with the review, and they saw something in that, so I got asked to go on their writer development programme. So that's when it really and that was in my kind of mid-20s, so that's when I started to feel I was breaking out of Nottingham and making some kind of connection with the industry in a wider sense.
When did you first recognise that you were pretty good at this whole writing career?
I haven't yet. I think when I tell you when. I think I went on a workshop at Soho Theatre, and there was about 4 or 5 playwrights on this new writing workshop, and it was really good. And it was the first time I'd actually sat down with people and been taught the principles of writing. Because prior to that, I hadn't read a book about playwriting or anything. I'd just kind of gone from my own instinctive knowledge, and it was just great. And then at the end of this week, we all took an extract of something that we'd written in, and they got actors in, professional actors in, to do sort of just explore the scenes a bit. And I watched the others, and they were all really good. And then I was really nervous when mine was coming up, but I just saw something about the actors really connecting with the characters in a way I felt they hadn't quite connected with the others. And there was just some indefinable thing where I thought, oh, I get it. I get what actors are looking for in character. I get that they're looking for this thing to play. They're looking for often the scene is about power, where the power lies. And I can't even remember what it was, but it was just a bit of a light bulb moment about what these words on a page, if you're a playwright, actually what happens is then they go into the hands and the mouths and the hearts and the heads of actors. And character is everything, because that's really what an actor connects with in theatre. So I think that, and I thought, oh, I think I can do that. I think I get it. So from then on, I've always been, character over everything really, character-driven stories, and I think that served me very well, that, and of course, when you get produced and you get good feedback in the rehearsal room and you sit with an audience watching a play and you realise they're engaged with it and they're enjoying it, and then that it's confidence building. So my confidence has built as I've gone through it. But you still, even now I'm writing a first draft of something now, and even now I'm just thinking, I don't know how to do it. I can't figure it out. It's too difficult. So it never leaves you, but I think that's quite good that it never leaves you, because actually, if you become complacent, then what?
Thank you for your honesty. I'd love to know more about your style of writing. Could you tell me more about the way that you do that?
Yeah, I mean, it is. I'm interested in character when I sit down to write. I suppose what I start with is a subject or a world, or just. I don't think I start particularly with character or voices. For instance, Be My Baby, which was the one I eventually went on to write for Soho, that began as a competition entry for they were doing a new writing competition on the subject of food. So we had to write a 10-minute play on the subject of food. So I thought about having an actor baking a cake on stage, and from that came the idea that it was a birthday cake for a child this character had given up for adoption, and every year she baked this cake to mark that moment. So I wrote this little play and put it in the competition, and it didn't get anywhere. Apparently there were 6 chosen to be performed, and this was the 7th. But Soho said, well, there's something about it we like, so see if you can develop some ideas. So I started thinking about this character and what was happening to her now with a grown-up adopted daughter somewhere out there, but also started thinking about what her backstory was, and started reading about unmarried mother and baby homes, where in the 60s she would have gone probably to have her baby and have them given up, have the baby sort of forcibly taken from her and given up for adoption. And it's reading about those, go, oh, that's the play. That's amazing, because it's an untold story. It's about women's lives, which I was very interested in foregrounding in my work, instinctively interested in it. And then when it became noticed that I was doing that, became very consciously more interested in doing it. So people go, oh, why do you write lots of female characters? And you go, well, because you asked that question, that's why. So really, Be My Baby began with this world of the home, the unmarried mothers, and that sense of girls being made to give up children against their will. So there's a kind of social history and a political aspect to it, and a sense of untold stories. And then from that started to build character and relationships. Who would be in this home? How would they relate to each other? What would they be thinking and feeling? What would they bring into the home? What would the character's journey be? So I think I look for a kind of an issue or a world or an injustice, or just something that gives it something that I'm interested in. And I think as a journalist, and have been sort of researching and finding stories, I take that through my playwriting career. So Amateur Girl was about the amateur porn industry, and I was interested in all of that and talking to people who'd done that. The Thrill of Love is about Ruth Ellis, who was the last woman to be hanged in Britain in the 50s, which was, again, it wasn't so much the character of Ruth, but Ruth's story, and again, that injustice, and looking again at that. Doing a play at the moment about women's football in the 20s. The 1920s was massive in the 1920s, and then it got banned. So again, that world of the women's football team, and the political issue at the heart of that is where it all starts, I think. And then the character and the story grows out of that.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. What do you find comes easy for you in the process?
I think dialogue is my most where I feel most at home with character and dialogue. But you can't write that unless you know what story you're telling, really. I mean, you can keep sort of writing dialogue and see what story emerges, and that happens. It's hard to describe because it's a two-way thing, really. But what I find what I find most difficult is structuring the play, the kind of nuts and bolts of the play, and thinking, you know, what is this play about? Where is it set? What am I trying to say? And actually, how practically do you make this into a piece of theatre? And once that's been done, I find the dialogue, you know, if I know who my characters are and where they're going and what they're saying, I really love writing dialogue. And that's the kind of pleasurable bit, really. But really, that doesn't kick in properly till like the third or fourth draft. You know, the first draft is all about just the building the engine, really, the nuts and bolts and the machinery of the play that the audience doesn't necessarily see. Because then you sort of, you know, you build the car around it or whatever, you know, the shiny red car, it looks really nice. So yeah, but I love writing character and I love writing dialogue. That's my favourite thing.
What do you most struggle with in your process?
I think structure, and also the uncertainty of it, that, you know, when you're commissioned to, you know, it's very fortunate to be commissioned to write a play, but you start off with the seed of an idea, some thoughts, you have a conversation with the theatre company, but then you have to make that into a real piece of work. And it's a contract to do that, and it's you know, an expectation on yourself that you will do it. So actually, just having the stamina to work through from that seed of an idea of a conversation, research it, think about it, come up with an idea, write a first draft, feel very insecure about the first draft, get some feedback, write a second draft, that doesn't feel right either, and then, you know, go through many drafts, often over, you know, a few years that can take, and just having the stamina to keep believing in it and keep having the faith that sooner or later you'll go, yes, this is it, this is the play, this is what I wanted. And often that doesn't happen at the end of the writing process, because you end up just running out of time, but it can happen in the rehearsal room, or it can happen in a second production. You can go, oh yes, that's what I was doing. But it takes a lot of stamina, I think, and ultimately, even though you can have fantastic collaborators, you are on your own. You're on your own in that room with the computer, day after day, just thrashing it out, trying to figure it out, trying to stay focused, trying to stay confident. So that's difficult, and I think in a way that's what makes writers, just keeping their bum on the chair till it's done, really.
Yeah, you know? Definitely agree with you on that.
Yeah, stamina is everything.
Can you tell me about the first play you wrote?
The first proper play I wrote was called Stand Up Cherry Pie, and it was a monologue, because I thought a monologue might be easier to write than a multi-cast piece, because I hadn't written a full-length play, and it was about a stand-up comedian who kind of made it in that era before alternative comedy, when comedy was very sexist and racist and abysmal, basically the kind of stuff I'd grown up watching on telly, which you now look back on and think, I cannot believe that stuff went out. But she sort of came up through that route and navigated her way through, and then sort of had fame and fell and was lifting herself back up again. So it was a bit of a kind of that sort of rags to riches story of that character. And that was the first thing I wrote that was a complete piece as an adult, where I thought it had something about it. And that we put that on with Takeaway, and we did 2 or 3 productions of that over the years. So it was very, very first thing. And I haven't read it for, I don't know, since we did it, so I'll probably look back now and I don't know. But I think there's things in that play that I'm still, you know, I think some people say, you know, as a writer, you're always writing the same story, you're always trying to write the same story better. And I think that was about women's lives, untold stories of women's lives, social history, all of that, entertainment, the sort of the onstage character and the backstage character and identity. And I think loads of those themes I'm still very much alive in my work. And always will be, probably.
Yeah. Was there anyone who gave you your big break or really championed you as you were going through this career?
There's been loads of people along the way who've opened doors and given me a career really. I mean, starting with Gina at Takeaway, who was the first person who said, I'll put your play on, which then was just a massive thing, and a massive kind of leap of faith by her really. So that was a turning point for me. Soho Theatre, Abigail Morris at Soho Theatre, who judged that playwriting competition about food and chose the 6th but liked the 7th, which was mine, and gave me some development money to develop what would Be My Baby, and directed that first production. And I think without her I wouldn't have had the career opening up in the way it did when I was in my late 20s. And I think had there been a male director of that company, I'm not sure he would have connected with the subject matter of the birth mother and the adoption and all that play was saying in the way that Abigail did. And she was a young mother herself, and I just think something in that story, however raw it was, really resonated with her. So she was a key person really in believing in me and getting my stuff on in a London theatre, which, you know, was a big jump really. And then from that I got an agent, and from that I got sort of interest from lots of regional theatres, and I mainly worked in the regions. You know, I haven't worked in London actually. That was worked in London then. I think that was it might be the only London commission I've had. So I kind of went on and had a more kind of national career than a London-centric career. And in those theatres, there've been numerous people, I think, who've connected with the work and opened doors. But I would say Gina and Abigail in the early days were the ones, really.
Yeah. When did the theatre become your career?
Well, it kind of gradually became my career in sort of the late 90s. Because there was, throughout the 90s, there was this transition period between earning my living as a writer and writing plays for myself, and then gradually getting productions of the plays and getting paid for it. So by the time I'd worked for New Perspectives in the late 90s and I got commissions from them, and Soho was showing interest around 2000, 2001, I think. No, earlier than that possibly, yeah, late 90s. Sorry, yeah. Soho Theatre started producing my work in the late 90s. So that was when the difference, the change was made really. And I started earning money as a playwright and getting opportunities. So then I kind of phased out the journalism and also got an agent. So that meant I had, that opened doors as well. Yeah, so I'd say from the age of about being 28-ish, 28, 38, yeah, so 25 or so years ago now. I think time flies.
What gave you the confidence to pursue this as a career?
I think it's hard to say, because I don't know whether in the beginning it was confidence. I think it was a desire I felt like a writer, and I wanted to be a writer as a child, but I hadn't ever met any writers, and writers sort of seemed to me so distant and so magical, and probably, either, living in ivory towers or long dead or something. So I had no idea how to do it. But getting into freelance journalism as a writer, and almost doing that as a way to get out of university, because the idea of I got a place at Manchester Poly to do English Lit, but I just don't think I had the confidence to go. I just didn't at that age. And I think it's a thing, isn't it, where at 18 or 17 or 18 we're supposed to be able to decide what we want to do and who we want to be, and leave home and go to a different city and be that person and go into a career. And I didn't feel like that at that age. So doing the freelance journalism was almost a way of backing away from all of that and thinking, I've got to do something so I don't have to leave Nottingham and go to university. It's too daunting. I'll start writing, because I want to be a writer one day, so I might as well do it now. And that looks like it takes a lot of confidence. I think it took a lot of bravado, And I don't know what I'm saying now I would have said then. I've kind of styled it out and kind of, you know, pretended I was much more confident than I was. But there must have been something in me as well that had a belief that I could do it, and I don't know where that belief came from. I mean, I was encouraged to read, and when I wrote stuff at school in creative writing, you know, and my parents would say it was good, but there was nothing that really, I don't know, it was just a light inside me. There was something that was struck. I don't know why or how, but I just believed I could do it. And then I had to kind of give my character the confidence to carry that through, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
You know, my inner self had the belief, and I had to learn confidence, I think. And I learnt it by doing it, really, which is the best way to learn anything, I think. And it was stressful, but it kind of worked out in the end.
Paid off.
Yeah, it did, yeah.
What was your biggest setback in your career?
That's a really good question, actually. I don't know as I've had anything that's felt like a setback. I don't know, that's a really interesting question. I think the thing that I think we're now being more aware of lack of representation in theatre and female playwrights being historically less valued, or the subjects that women write about being slightly devalued as being domestic or sort of shallow in some way. And you know, there used to be the idea of only men can write the big political plays that will be on the big stages of the National Theatre, and I wasn't writing that kind of play. So I think certain avenues of theatre, certain routes, have not been as open to me as a woman. But having said that, my whole career and the work I've done has been based on writing about women's lives and my femaleness. So I wouldn't trade that for anything. So I wouldn't call that a setback as such, but it's an obstacle that's always been there, I think.
Yeah.
And is still there, and it's certainly, you know, I'm really happy to see there's such a wide and candid discussion now about it among female playwrights, because there weren't that many female playwrights when I started. I didn't really know anybody, and you probably wouldn't have gone on about it. You know, that was how it would have looked. And I think the sort of, you know, the discussion and debate and awareness that we now have is going to change things for the better, I think.
Yeah. What do you most enjoy about your job?
I enjoy the fact that I don't have to go to the office or wear a suit or, you know, sit in traffic at 7 every morning. I enjoy that freedom, that personal freedom of being able to work from home and to be able to manage my own time and be free in that. Like, you know, I always felt there's a lot of insecurity in being a freelancer, financial insecurity. You never know from one year to the next whether you're going to get work or what have you. But I've always seen that as a motivation, and I've always managed somehow to keep going. So I enjoy that personal freedom of being a writer. And I still love to write. I still love to sit down at my desk. If there's not too much crazy time pressure or too much work going on, I'm really happy writing, you know, and if I can get all the other stuff out of my head about what people are going to think of it and how it's going to be received and whether I'm going to get it in time, if I can just purely focus on the writing, I love that, and I still love it. And I think if I don't love it anymore, I would stop. I'd have to stop. I don't think you can do it if you don't love it.
Yeah.
So yeah, the writing.
I agree with that. What isn't quite so good about your job?
What isn't quite so good about my job is, I think, the time it takes to write something, to get it right. I think juggling 4 or 5 or 6 different projects sometimes is hard, which is not something I'd complain about, because most writers would be delighted to have, it's a kind of nice problem to have, but often I am working on several things at once, not in the same day, but certainly every few days I might be changing and chopping and changing something else. And I would love to be able to just be working on one thing for a sustained period of time. So that can be difficult. It can be a bit manic, but it is a good problem to have. I just think the whole wider issues of the politics in the industry is difficult, as I've said, about representation, equality, whose voice gets heard and whose doesn't. All that can be very dispiriting, really, because theatres are, they're not run by a committee, they're run by individual people who make those commissioning decisions, and those gatekeepers, if the gatekeeper likes you and opens the door, that's very good, but it's not the most accessible industry for a lot of people still. So that is a frustration, really, and can be quite depressing about theatre, I think.
Yeah. I'd like to talk to you about the changes in the industry for women.
Yeah.
What have you noticed?
I have noticed, I think there's more young women writing now. That's something I have noticed. I don't think there's I think there's still not an abundance of opportunities. I think there's a recognition that women's voices matter more than they were seen to matter. The subjects women write about are more worthy of consideration than maybe they were when I started out. But I still think there's quite a long way to go. I think on the other hand, what's interesting that people are waking up to is that it's always been the case that women buy theatre tickets. Women statistically are the ones who book the tickets and to go with their friends or their partners, or their husbands or their male partners, if that's what, if that's who they are. And so it makes commercial sense to write plays and stories from a female perspective about women's lives. And I think that commercial imperative is now being recognised. And I think shows about, just for the obvious one is Mamma Mia, isn't it? Whatever you think about Mamma Mia, it's an extraordinary commercial success. So, I hope some of that filters down, and I hope some of the more political work that women are writing gets the same kind of attention. It's not just something women don't write just like the big feel-good girls' night out musicals. We can write anything we want to write.
Yeah.
And I think we're still trying to fight that battle. Just as we're trying, I think we thought kind of feminism had won, and now we're kind of going, oh my God, there's still so many more battles to fight. Theatre's one of them.
What are the advantages? I'm saying that really right? Of being a woman in your role.
I think you can find an audience, you can speak very directly to, as I say, because women are the theatre goers and the theatre ticket buyers, and I think if you can connect with that audience and speak directly to that audience, it keeps your work alive. And one thing that's interesting, a kind of side thing about my work, is that it gets done extensively on the amateur circuit, and amateur theatre companies have predominantly female members, and there's been historically a kind of dearth of plays with strong female casts, or just numerically more women than men in. And things like Be My Baby, Ladies' Day, or The Ladies Down Under sequel, and The Thrill of Love get, sort of 75, 80 productions a year, so every week one of those are on somewhere. And it's simply because women in those companies want to play those roles and want to tell those stories. So that, and also in terms of my keeping the work alive, keeping plays alive that are sort of 20 odd years old, Be My Baby, Ladies' Day, 15 nearly coming on 20 years old. The fact that they're still being done regularly in sort of villages and communities across the country is because of that female connection, really. So that's been a huge advantage to my career, kind of accidentally, because I never set out to do that. And also financially, because that is a way for me to, you know, it's an income stream as well. So it's not always about having, you know, the big critically acclaimed show in London that's going to make you a career. Actually, that has been happening sort of very quietly without any kind of acknowledgement or any kind of recognition, really. But it's happening, it's real, you know, and people who are in those plays love being in those plays and love playing those characters and love telling those stories. And that's what you want. You don't really want a play to be done once and even published and then put on a shelf and got out once every 10 years. You know, the fact that those plays are living and breathing now is because they're by a woman, about women, for women. And I'm as happy with that as I am, you know, with getting a great review in The Guardian. You know, lovely, a great review in The Guardian, brilliant. But where then? You know, you want the work to live. Yeah. And that's been a really accidentally surprising and wonderful thing about my work, I think.
Yeah. While doing research on you, Amanda, I did come across, I think it was a quote from The Guardian about you being the most consistent woman in regards to playwright. How did you feel when you maybe read that quote or you came across that quote? How did that make you feel as a woman in this career?
Well, a bit of a double-edged sword, really, because it's brilliant to be said your work is consistently popular or you're the biggest selling female playwright, but I don't want to be. If I'm one of the biggest selling playwrights then, if I'm one of the biggest selling female playwrights. And to genderize it in the way that men's writing never is now I kind of feel quite angry about it in a way. I mean, that quote is a few years old, I think, and then I think when I first see that quote, I go, oh, that's really nice. And then I've, you know, over the years been thinking, actually, why is it gendered? Why? Because it is like we're this sort of second subcategory of playwrights, you know. Well, there's like the male canon of playwrights, then there's Carol Churchill, then there's the rest of us, you know. Because do we hear, you know, you don't hear Carol Churchill very often called greatest female playwright. She's one of our greatest playwrights, end of. But most of us get just that sticker put on us. And yeah, I feel quite militant about it now. And I would challenge it now in a way I wouldn't have done. Going back to your question about being, you know, what's changed really, I would feel confident to challenge that now in a way that probably 15 years ago I wouldn't have. So yeah, obviously it's lovely to get a compliment, but you've also got to be aware of what context you're being placed in, I think.
Definitely. Thank you for sharing. What are the disadvantages of your role in
as
your career?
As a woman?
Yeah.
The disadvantages, I think having to work twice as hard to prove yourself, having to justify why your stories might be political and meaningful, because I think you're allowed to be entertaining and funny and you know, as I say, you tell women's stories to women and women love it kind of thing, but actually I would say that my work is the choices that I make are political choices. The choice in Be My Baby to put 6 women on stage in that play with no male characters was a political choice. And I don't think any of that got really noticed at the time. And also when that play came out, it was the kind of what they call the in-your-face theatre of Sarah Kane and all of that. And I think Be My Baby looked quite kind of domestic and traditional against those. I think now it's probably being reassessed a bit. It had a fantastic production at Leeds Playhouse in 2019. And for me it was like watching the play again, because it was a kind of new generation of actors and director and everything kind of coming to this play as if it was a big political piece of political theatre. So I think the disadvantages have been, you know, having to justify and prove your worth, really, instead of just being able to get on with it. But having said all that, I wouldn't change anything, you know, because I am female and that's the perspective I naturally write from. So to feel aggrieved about that would be wrong, really. I'm very proud of that, and I'm very glad that I can tell those stories, and just need the rest of the world to come round to it, really.
I know you just said that you wouldn't change anything, but if you did have a magic wand, what and you could change one thing in the industry that you're in, what would it be?
I think, you know what, I would change this relationship between London and the rest of the UK, because the idea of the National Theatre being in this concrete building in the middle of London, and a very elitist organisation from my experience and other people's experience, a very patriarchal organisation. The evidence is there about how many women they've put on stage, or in terms of diversity, writers of colour, all of that. It's a very white, male, patriarchal, middle class organisation that calls itself the National Theatre, and it's not. You know, the National Theatre, we need to really rethink that, I think. And I hate this term, the regions. There's no such thing as the regions, because that's, again, it's that kind of patriarchal London and everybody around it. The regions is the UK. That's British theatre. It's not what's happening. As much as I love the West End and London, that's not British theatre. What we are doing out here in all the cities and towns and villages across the country is British theatre. So I would like to see that radically change in some way in terms of our perception of that hierarchy of the industry, and where the power lies and where the status lies and where the important work is done. I would like that to be smashed to bits, really.
I couldn't agree more with you. What's your greatest achievement?
Just sticking at it, staying here, sticking at it, stamina, just carrying on. That's it.
Is there a play that you are most proud of?
I think in one sense you'd say it's the one I'm writing at the moment, because that's the one that feels most immediate, and one hopes one gets better and better, so you always hope that the play you're writing now is your best play, in terms of everything about it, content and theme and style and all of that. So the one I'm always very interested in what I'm writing, what I'm going to write. I don't really like looking back too much, but Be My Baby I'm very proud of because of what it continues to say and what it continues to be. I say this a lot, but a play that was written in the 90s about the 60s is now being performed by girls who weren't born when I wrote it, and young women who are completely connecting with it in a way that even I don't know exactly what that is, but that thread going through the writing and the subject and what women now connect with, a play about women giving babies for adoption, and that sense of, control of sexuality or identity is as alive now as it ever has been in that play, because people are finding that in it again, finding that and revisiting that play and performing it and really loving it. So I think the longevity of that play and the fact that it still remains so relevant is fantastic. But of course, I wrote that in my mid-20s, so you don't want to think that the thing you did in your mid-20s is the great thing that you did. So always it's the one now and the next one, I think, that I'm hoping will be the one.
How would you suggest a young person can get into this industry?
I think, I don't know whether it's everything's changed since I started. There was no internet, all we had was a phone and a typewriter. That's what I started with. Obviously, the nature of communications and media and performance and all of that is changing, although obviously theatre is still theatre. But I think it's harder because it's harder to get paid for stuff. I think theatre, the public sector, is shrinking, and so there's less money for development. But I think also, and having done, reading unsolicited scripts for theatres and competitions and all of that, and working with students, if somebody's got something as a writer, it's immediately obvious as of a young or emerging writer, no matter how old they are, actually a new writer. You can tell, you can just see it, and it doesn't matter how bad the craft is. Say if there is just something about because theatre's about individual voices, and I think it's the same as it always was. If you've got something to say and you tell your truth as a writer, and that is there on the page, that will be heard, because actually it's quite rare. You can read a lot of new scripts that might be quite well crafted but have nothing to say. But you can write something read something that's a mess, but you go, oh my God, that voice. And I would say to new writers, don't try and be original, try to be truthful, tell your truth. Because if it's your truth, it will be original, because no one's got your life and no one's had the journey you had and no one's experienced the world quite like you do. So I think you've just got to write and find your truth and find your voice and get it on the page somehow and send it out and trust that someone will hear it. Might not be the first person, but theatres are always looking out for those voices. And I think being female is an advantage, not a disadvantage. There are more obstacles. There are always more obstacles for people who aren't young white men. There always will be, but that's what gives you your truth. And I think there's more awareness and understanding that we have to tell those stories now than there was when I started out.
Yeah.
So I just say go for it.
What advice would you give your younger self?
I would say you're onto something. Just have faith, be a little bit more confident, don't worry, just keep at it, because it's you're gonna be able to do what you want to do. So chill out, just get on with it.
Lastly, is there anything you'd like to talk about that I haven't asked you already?
I don't think so. Your questions have been brilliant, and you've covered so many aspects of the industry as well as my experience. I suppose I would say that one of the great things about writing is that, and being a playwright, is everybody's route into it is different. So this is just my story, and because I did it this way doesn't mean that's the way it's done. And it's in a way, it's, you can like an actor can work in school and amateur sector and maybe set up a company and then go to drama school and then get an agent and try and get work. That's a more kind of formal route. Not all actors go that way, but there's a more formal route for, say, actors in theatre. But for writers, there is no set way in. You could do a creative writing degree, or you could not have a degree. It doesn't make, or you can never have written anything in your life, or you could have been writing since you were the age of 4, or blah, 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 blah. You do it, you can invent your own way in, and you try and find your way in, your way through, and your way towards your truth that is yours alone. So I would say listen to writers like me talking, but don't think I should be doing it that way, because everybody is different.
Thank you so much for answering these questions. It's been a privilege and a pleasure talking to you, Amanda. Thank you very much.
Thank you.